assembled here for the third plenary session of the National Conference on Jawaharlal Man, India and Nation. For today's session, we have with us Mr. Ajoy Ashirwad, who is a political editor, the writer and columnist and commentator Plenary. He will be providing us an insight into the topic, Nehru, the man behind the politician. Ajoy Ashirwad is a political affairs editor at The Wire, where he writes on the real politics and its influences. At his previous workplace, Plenary, he reported on politics, conflicts, farmers' issues, history, and art. I'm delighted to welcome our moderator, Mr. Shaheen Akil, an independent journalist focusing on class and communal violence in India, currently pursuing law from Government Law College, Ernakulam, for the session. I invite our moderator, Mr. Shaheen Akil, to take over the session. Please.
So, just like you all are, I'm also very excited to listen to Ajoy Ashirwad's talk here today. And after his session, I'll be moderating this. So I invite Mr. Ajoy Ashirwad to deliver this speech.
So good afternoon, everyone. I understand this is post-lunch session. I'll try hard not to make you sleep through the scene, but I have something prepared. I'd like to kind of, which touches upon my topic, Nehru, the man behind the politician. And let me see, I'll kind of start with my paper. And in case if you want to stop me or have questions around this, please feel free to ask. So, I'm truly honored to be among the esteemed speakers of the symposium. While thanking the organizers, I should add that discussing Nehru in an organized platform in today's day and age is in itself a radical act. For our Prime Minister has been the biggest subject of vilification and even ridiculed by the forces that are dominating India now. Disinformation, I'm sure all of you know about this. Disinformation regarding Jawaharlal Nehru is abundant in the internet world today, where knowledge is sought to be consumed not through books or researchers, but through WhatsApp and the larger social media. I'm sure that most of you may have come across one or two lies about him. There exists an elaborate website that unpretentiously calls itself Dismantling Nehru, the Last Viceroy of India. In a way, equating him to a foreigner and not a leader who fought in a nationalist movement. Apart from manufacturing facts about him, this website also carries listicles like 97 major blunders of Nehru. That list has now expanded itself to 127 historic blunders of Nehru. And my favorite amongst all the lies that circulates about Nehru is, of course, the one which claims that Nehru had a Muslim ancestry and how he cunningly hid his faith from Indians for the sake of power. Our times are such that after a point you can't help but laugh at such nonsensical pronouncements. Irrespective of what is happening around us, I congratulate the Bishop Moore College for making a serious attempt to understand Nehru and his luminous legacy. The scholars in the seminar here will analyze his multiple sides. I mean, Nehru wore many hats. That of a statesman, a historian, a committed Democrat, a secularist. Apart from being the most loved leader of his time who gave direction to India during his formative years. But why? But I will restrict myself to Nehru, the man, and try to look at two of his personality traits that remained consistent in all his interventions. I believe that may give an idea of how Nehru was as a person and what makes him stand out as a public figure. Before that, however, I think it will be good to narrate three stories about him that may help you imagine him in action. The first is one which the renowned Hindi poet Ashok Bajpai recalled in a recent seminar in Delhi. On the occasion of 50th death anniversary of Leo Tolstoy, the famous writer of the Soviet Union in New Delhi in the 1960s, there was a grand function with Nehru, then in his last stage of prime ministership and already a celebrated statesman and a post-colonial hero to the world. As a chief guest, speaking about Tolstoy, Nehru gave a short but terse speech. He said that there are two kinds of greatness in the world. One, when you meet a great person, you feel dwarfed. You feel very small in front of that person. And the second kind of great people is when you meet that person, you feel empowered, enabled. Tolstoy belonged to the second category, Nehru said. That was Nehru for you. Stephen Spender, the editor of the prestigious journal Encounter, later came onto the stage and said that as the editor of the journal, Spender kept meeting several prime ministers and presidents of countries. But today, in the 1960s, there was no statesman in the world who can possibly say something like what Nehru had just said. Nehru did not put himself at the top. He tried to emulate how he perceived Tolstoy. He was always a learner, observant about what was going on, and was ready to correct his mistakes and positions if he felt that it was the right thing to do. And that is probably why so many other great leaders in their memoirs have said that he could easily make people comfortable around him. And not for nothing, he will always remain a chacha, an uncle for millions of Indian children. The second incident I would like to speak about was recently recalled by the great historian Irfan Habib. In 1954, Habib, a devoted Marxist then, wrote a letter to Nehru about the Home Ministry's objections to issuing a passport to him. Habib had applied for a passport to pursue his research in England, and although Nehru knew his father Muhammad Habib, a nationalist historian himself very well, Irfan Habib did not mention his identity in the letter. Yet Nehru gave him an immediate appointment and spent 20 minutes with him at the PM's office. He spoke with Habib about perceptions about the international situation at the time, and mostly about China. After the meeting, Nehru wrote to Habib's Vice Chancellor, Dr. Zakir Hussain, that he didn't agree or concur with his views, but also overruled Home Ministry's objections at the time. Habib received his passport in the next few days. The third instance was one I read some time ago. During his prime ministerial tenure, a few students in Delhi strongly opposed Nehru on certain issues. They planned a demonstration following which the Delhi police wanted to arrest the protesters. The word reached Nehru, who was informed that demonstration and criticism could have political fallouts for him, and these demonstrations were politically motivated by a group of leftist students. Nehru remarked that the students getting attracted by leftist thoughts were perfectly fine with him and was nothing new. Who in their right mind would be not drawn towards the left as a student? He ordered not to pursue any legal action against the demonstrating group. That legacy of Nehru has endured until recently. We all know how Manmohan Singh, then the Prime Minister, was shown black flags by a group of JNU students when he had visited the university back in I think 2008, but immediately after he was shown the black flag, he called up the vice chancellor, also his friend B.D. Bhattacharya, to be lenient towards the protesters and not take any strong action. Bhattacharya, the VC of JNU, wanted to pursue at least disciplinary action against the protesters, but Singh who just put down. In contrast, the last decade saw many dissenting students like Umar Khalid, Sarjun Imam, Gulfisha Fatima, and even Kanhaiya Kumar, and many others being incarcerated and imprisoned on charges of sedition and even anti-terror laws like UAPA. Nehru personified a big and compassionate heart. He respected democratic thought and, in fact, wrote extensively on why a strong opposition is not only crucial but also mandatory for sustaining democracy, of which he was a firm believer. This brings me to the two aspects of his personality that I want to speak about. Nehru was one of those world leaders who was guided by one, empathy, and two, hindsight. Nehru grew up in a household devoid of children. Some may call his childhood lonely, but he always had the company of elderly people. Having lost his first wife and child, Nehru's father was extra careful in his second marriage. He trained Nehru under an English governess and private tutors who played a big role in building his liberal worldview. His cousins were much older. He had his sisters only when he was already approaching his teenage years. In his growing up years, he saw his father, Motilal Nehru, entertaining his English and Muslim friends. There were no communal divisions in his household or any kind of communal darkness in his household, although his mother was deeply religious. He was exposed to the problems of colonialism in India from early childhood during discussions of his father with his friends. Yet, his sheltered childhood protected him from social evils for a long time. Subsequently, in England, he developed his intellectual prowess, and in India, he learned first-hand about the criminalities of British rule in great detail. In the process, Nehru became a deeply empathetic person. His understanding, driven primarily by a sense of empathy for the underprivileged, unprivileged, and the marginalized sections of India. I will cite some examples from his writings. In his autobiography, he remembers how his visit to Uttar Pradesh's Pratapgarh, one of the most poorest districts of the time in the 1920s, exposed him to the extent of poverty in the hinterland. And I quote, he writes, looking at them means peasants, and their misery and overflowing gratitude, I was filled with shame and sorrow. Shame at my own easygoing and comfortable life, and our petty politics of the city, which ignored this vast multitude of semi-naked sons and daughters of India. Sorrow and degradation and overwhelming poverty of India. A new picture of India seemed to rise before me, naked, starving, crushed, and utterly miserable. And their faith in us, casual visitors from distant city, embarrassed me and filled me with a new responsibility that frightened me. I listened to their innumerable tales of sorrow, their crushing and ever-growing burden of rent, illegal exactions, ejectments from land, and mud hut and beatings, surrounded on all sides by vultures who preyed on them, zamindars, agents, money lenders, police, toiling all day to find that what they produced was not theirs, and their reward was kicks and curses and a hungry stomach. Many of those who were present were landless people who had been ejected by the landlords and had no land or hut to fall back upon. The land was rich, but the burden on it was very heavy. The holdings were small and there were too many people after them. Taking advantage of this land hunger, the landlords enabled under the law to enhance rent beyond a certain percentage, charge huge illegal premiums. The tenant, knowing of no other alternative, borrowed money from the money lender and paid the premium, and then unable to pay his debt and even the rent, was ejected and lost all he had. Besides the rent, there was an extraordinary number of illegal exactions. It is notorious how talukdars often make their tenants pay for every special expenditure, a marriage in the family, a cost of the son's education in foreign countries, a part to the governor or other high official, a purchase of a car or an elephant. Indeed, these exactions have got special names. Motrauna tax, which means tax for purchase of a motor, Hatona tax for purchase of an elephant. Having been reporting over the last 2 decades in India's hinterland myself, I can vouch that it isn't for anyone, at least a city-bred person, even now, to understand the systemic problems of villages in such great detail. unless the person is genuinely interested in knowing about the plight of the people, and Nehru was showing that kind of genuine interest, and that comes only with deep empathy and love for people who you consider your own. There are numerous such examples in Nehru's writing where he talks about the poor. His focus was constantly on the poor, even when he devoted himself to theorizing all aspects of governance and statehood as a politician. That also explains his decisions to weaken the zamindari system and initiate land reforms in India soon after he became the Prime Minister of India. Nehru was virulently opposed to all forms of communalism, for he saw tenets of European fascists in all those people who behaved inimically towards people from faiths different from theirs. But he also realized that the majority community had a special responsibility, and this is important because he realized that the majority community had a special responsibility to keep communal forces out. As an ardent believer in the composite culture of India, I quote, a special responsibility does attach to the Hindus in India, both because they are the majority community and because economically and educationally they are more advanced. He distinguished between what he called quote unquote honest communalism and false communalism. Fear and insecurity in minorities can trigger communal sentiments among minorities, but that could be qualified as honest communalism as opposed to false communalism propagated by the majority community. While understanding this, he however detested all forms of communalism as he attempted to steer India towards an inclusive and democratic society. One communalism does not end the other. Each feeds on the other and both fatten, he said. He put the Muslim League and the Hindu Mahasabha in the league of similar opportunistic forces. Yet, such a nuanced understanding of communalism, especially at a time when all forms of effort, at a time now when all forms of affirmative action for minorities are also being seen as the so-called pseudo-secular policy of appeasement by Hindu communists, is a pleasant sight, so to say. Again, only a compassionate person can think so deeply. Similarly, he felt strongly against the secondary role that women played in Indian society. Not only did he advocate that women should have a much bigger role in the Indian nationalist movement, but also played a crucial role in reforming Hindu inheritance laws soon after he became the Prime Minister. He secured the women's right to divorce and also ended polygamy among Hindus. At the same time, he remained regretful of not being able to usher in such reforms for Muslim women. Nehru asked, the future of India cannot consist of dolls and playthings, and in you made half the population of the country a mere plaything of the other half, an encumbrance on the other. How will you ever make progress? He was also the first one to encourage their participation in public life. For example, he spoke about middle class women, peasant women, poor women, working class women, and rich women, so how they showed their organizational power in defying government orders during the civil disobedience movement. Like any modernist of those times, he detested the Parda system and equated the practice with an animal in the zoo or a person in the prison. He also believed that women's freedom depends on economic conditions more than political. How can women be free if she is not self-earning and depends on the income of her husband? He asked. Such an understanding seems commonsensical today, but imagine the tallest political leader of the country having such views that defied opinions of his own conservative colleagues like Rajendra Prasad and many others. He could still do it because he was Nehru, a compassionate soul, unafraid of saying what he believes is right, and sees in it the way forward for a newly independent India. Nehru was inspired by a range of political and social thoughts. He was a socialist, he was a Marxist, an intellectual who believed in enlightenment and its values, and at the same time was in awe of European scientific achievements and progress made in the fields of industrial production and technology. But more importantly, his inner self was guided by humanism. It was the basic commitment to humanism that he could shake off his trappings of richness, affluence, that he inherited from his father. Above all, he was committed to the idea of freedom and revered human spirit as the primary driver of societal growth. I quote Nehru here from one of his writings. How amazing is the spirit of the man, in spite of innumerable failings throughout the ages, has sacrificed his life and all he held dear for an ideal, for truth, for faith, for country and honor. That ideal may change, but his capacity for self-sacrifice continues. And because of that, much may be forgiven to a man, and it is impossible to lose hope for him. In the midst of disaster, he has not lost his dignity or his faith in the values he cherished. He has hurled defiance at the elemental powers with his mind being the cradle of revolution and sought to master them. Every aspect of his political life, his nationalism, his commitment to democracy, socialism, and secularism, even his internationalism, his foreign policy, his opinions on society flowed not only from his deep love for the country, but also from the anguish at the miserable state in which people of India lived and have been pushed to by years of colonial rule. That pain in his heart always comes through in each of his writings. And again, I'm citing another Nehru's quote. As far as I am concerned, I can speak with some certainty. We shall proceed with secular and national lines in keeping with the powerful trends towards internationalism. Whatever confusion the present may contain, in the future, India will be a land, as in the past, of many faiths, equally honored and respected, but one national outlook, not I hope of a narrow nationalism living in its own shell, but rather a tolerant, creative nationalism which believing in itself and the genius of its people that takes full part in establishment of an international order. The only ultimate aim we can have is that of one world. The other strong trait that Nehru displayed consistently through his life was his ability to take hindsight, historical hindsight, into account when making his decisions and forming his opinions. His political personality was also shaped by his incredible capacity to look back in the past and learn from it, then come up with a sustainable opinion on something, even as he didn't shy away from offering radical solutions for India that he was building. His historical works, Discovery of India and Glimpses of World History, weren't a professional history writing exercise, but attempts to understand the past and also learn from it so that he could be in a position to offer an independent India solutions to its present. But unlike today's rulers, he wasn't one who would see only glory and glamour in India's past, but through history, he wanted to correct the mistakes that we had made earlier. Despite not being a professional historian, he understood that history was not just a directionless narrative of chronology, but a resource to shape the future. Professor Aditya Mukherjee quotes Nehru in his recent book as urging historians in 1948. Nehru says history shows us both the binding process and disruptive process. Today, a little more obviously, the binding or constructive process are at work, as also the disruptive or the vociferous forces. And in any activity that we are indulging in, we have the choice of laying emphasis on the building and constructive aspect or the other. But Nehru also quickly goes on to add that, but we must not, of course, give way to wishful thinking and emphasize something which we want to emphasize, which had no relation to fact. Like today's political leaders, especially from the right, Hindu right, Nehru wasn't the one who would ever think of suppressing historical facts and removing historical references from textbooks or rewriting biased history for political gains. Such was his thirst to learn from an accurate description of the past. In that today what we see is so contrasting that one cannot imagine. We know how the current regime in India is hell bent on showing everything from India's ancient past as good and glorious, most of the time with no relation to fact whatsoever. In both his works, Discovery of India and Glimpses of World History, Nehru was particularly interested in the social aspect of the past, evolution of people, continuities and changes set within its context. And in doing so, Nehru deviated from the then colonial history framework that was adamant in dividing India's historical periods as Hindu, Muslim, and British. Nehru, however, sees through it. He says that the British rule was fundamentally different from the ancient and medieval periods when rulers assimilated themselves in the subcontinent society and created a composite culture. The British rule, on the other hand, brought about structural changes in the way India was ruled from outside as European colonialists expanded their capitalism, which had by then received a fillip by its industrial revolution. And only when capitalism turned imperial and behaved, the forces became imperial forces, it spelled doom on countries like India. Nehru understood that. Yet he wasn't inimical to the English people or for that Europeans. He understood the value of industrial and technological advancement and sought to emulate those in an independent India. He was friends with scholars of the West as much as he was with the scholars of the East. He could easily spot structural causes, and that helped him retain his empathetic self. Today, the Hindu right leaders keep talking about how India was free from 1,000 years of slavery, to include the assumption that even the medieval period ruled by Muslim rulers was a period of slavery. What they have actually done is to reassert the periodization of Indian history in the way that colonial historians or imperialist historians were doing at the time of our nationalist movement to keep the Indian society divided along religious lines. There can't be a greater irony that those who claim to be the biggest nationalists today have ended up legitimizing the colonial and Eurocentric view of Indian history. An example of Nehru's hindsight is aptly seen in one of his writings, and I quote, "If we look back at India's long history, we find that our forefathers made wonderful progress whenever they looked out on the world with clear and fearless eyes and kept the windows of their minds open to give and to receive. But in later periods, when they grew narrow in their outlook and shrank from outside influences, India suffered a setback politically and culturally." Can there be anything that is more relatable today when India is becoming more and more Indian, inward looking in the name of nationalism? And to top it all, Nehru wasn't making such a statement without reading our own historical sources. He had read the most important texts, Hindu texts like Vedas, Mahabharata, Ramayana, Purana, Shastras, and many other sources carefully and diligently to make such a claim. But a bigger irony in that those who fall back on the sources today to make a case of Hindu Rashtra may not even have touched these texts in their lifetime. Octavio, Octavio Paz, the great American poet, great Mexican poet and Nobel laureate, and also the Mexican ambassador to India during Nehru's time, spoke about Nehru's political personality in 1966. Paz said, and I quote, "It is remarkable that Nehru, in spite of his mainly being a political leader, did not fall into the temptation of suppressing the contradictions of history by brute force or with a verbal to the past, which is a sleight of hand. It is unique in our world of fanatical Manichaeans, the people who see things only in black and white and hangmen masked as philosophers of history. He did not pretend to embody either the supreme good or the absolute truth, but human liberty, man and his contradictions. He was faithful to his contradictions, and for this, the very reason he neither killed others nor mutilated himself. In contrast to the majority of political leaders of this century, Nehru did not believe that he had the key to history in his hands. And because of this, he did not stain his country nor the world with blood. His commitment to democracy was driven by such a historical way of thinking. To build a democracy, Nehru emphasized on the need of a robust opposition, and so much that at the peak of his popularity, when media was rarely critical of him, and this is interesting, he wrote critically of himself with a pseudonym Chanakya. Here these words from one of his pseudonymous articles. Men like, and this is Jawaharlal Nehru writing about himself under a pseudonym. Men like Jawaharlal, with all their capacity for great and good work, are unsafe in a democracy. A little twist, and Jawaharlal might turn a doctor's, sweeping aside the paraphernalia of a slow moving democracy. He might still use the language and slogan of democracy and socialism, but we all know how fascism has fattened on this language. He has all the makings of a dictator in him. Vast popularity, a strong will directed to a well-defined purpose, energy, pride, organizational capacity, ability, hardness, and with all his love of the crowd and intolerance of others and a certain contempt for the weak and the inefficient. His overmastering desire to get things done, to sweep away what he dislikes and build anew, will hardly brook for the slow process of democracy. Caesarism has always is always at the foot. And is it not possible that Jawaharlal might fancy himself as a Caesar? Well, the paragraph here certainly does not remind me of Nehru, but definitely shows a mirror to one who we have now as a political leader and who wants an opposition Mukt Bharat and doesn't miss a chance to deride even the smallest of criticism. He also emphasized on the freedom of press, and Nehru says in 40, the freedom of press does not consist in permitting such things as we like to appear. Even a tyrant is agreeable to this kind of freedom. Civil liberty and freedom of press consists in our permitting what we do not like, in our putting up with criticism of ourselves. Today, when much of the mainstream media has been brought under control of governments, and the journalists are being jailed, cartoonists are being censored. These words coming from an Indian political leader feels like another world totally. Even his most stringent critics, like the Niraj C. Chaudhary, a devoted individualist, agreed that Nehru was the moral compass of the nation when he served as the first prime minister. He was the one who unified the nation, actually gave the diverse and multifaceted India the shape of one nation. Given his own moral uprightness, he could still advocate a radical restructuring of India in the period following the years of what he called colonial degeneration. Why I emphasize on these two personality traits of Nehru, that of his empathy and his power of looking at things with a certain hindsight, is also because this has become such a rare quality amongst India's privileged classes today. Nehru was among India's privileged, and he could still shake off those trappings. Let alone the political class, how many of India's elites, be it the liberal elites, old feudal elite, or even the new elites, make an effort to connect with the Indian society and be empathetic towards the plight. We know that economic inequality has only risen in the last 2 decades, but the Indian elites have remained happy in their cocoons, unbothered, unconcerned, starkly opposite of how Nehru responded to such situations by thinking beyond himself and his immediate world. On the contrary, we find that Indian elites, instead of becoming conversation starters and opening up channels of engagement with the underprivileged, have often seen themselves as victims of situations and historical circumstances, even when the world of working classes has collapsed from bad to worse. They are more contemptuous of the poor, they're suspicious of the poor, and so self serving that their plight doesn't concern them at all. There was a Nehru at one time among India's elites who showed India a path towards inclusivity, secularism, and democracy. And there are many among those classes who couldn't care any less. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ajoy and Ashirwad. So we have explored some fascinating ideas about Nehru. Explored Nehru as a man, it is more than just a politician. So before we open the floors for questions, let me ask you, Mr. Ajoy, you talked about Nehru as a Marxist who was an agnostic as well as he's a Marxist, agnostic, and also a romantic, as we were discussing yesterday, in his personal life. But when it comes to his political life, he's a true secularist, a liberal, and also an advocate of mixed economy. And India has this strong admiration, this fervent admiration towards celibate and aromantic people since historical traditions, uh, and also when it comes to modern day figures like Mahatma Gandhi. or the contemporary icons like Rahul Gandhi or Mr. Narendra Modi. So I wanted to ask you if Nehru was just an accidental happening in the modern political history of India. Or let me rephrase my question, has India attained the level of political maturity to re-elect someone like Nehru as the Prime Minister again?
Well, what can I say? Nehru was not the only one who was like that. There was Nehru, of course, became the first prime minister, but there were a range of other political leaders during the Indian who participated in the Indian nationalist movement. And yet, and it wasn't just Nehru who was accepted by Indian people, Vallabhbhai Patel was also, and Mahatma Gandhi was also accepted by Indian people. After Patel, after Mahatma and Patel, Nehru was the most popular leader of the. But he was, like you said, he was influenced by many thoughts. He was, I feel, like any of us, a man full of contradictions, trying to resolve it within his or her own self and trying to kind of guide India towards some kind of modern state. And throughout his kind of tenure, you would see that he was brutally honest. He was not shy of articulating his own positions, even changing his positions in due course of time. And he may have certain weaknesses. He may have certain he may have erred or done some mistakes in during his public life, but he was what he was, a deeply empathetic person who had an incredible capacity to learn from his past. So I'm not sure whether we have those kind, and Nehru, especially what he was, like I pointed out in my paper, that despite coming from a affluent family, he could still give it all up. He was ready to kind of sacrifice all his wealth, all his cultural capital for the sake of the nation, to create something which is new, which is inclusive, and where everyone is respected. And despite being from the fundamental rights and duties, he was the first one when in 1931 Karachi resolution of the in National Congress was mooted. Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi read out the resolution, but it was Nehru who drafted that resolution, and that resolution actually was the mother of what we now have know as fundamental rights in our constitution. So he was an open personality. He understood that there are structural causes in which India had gotten exploited by the colonial rulers. But he also knew that there were many things to learn from the West and incorporate it into a nation which has just achieved its freedom.
So I think we can open the floor for questions.
The first question is, you're talking about Nehru being the harbinger of the freedom of speech. But if I remember correctly, the first amendment to the Indian Constitution was bringing reasonable restrictions on the freedom of the press. So that's one. I think a couple of other things are also there which brought restrictions to freedom of press. That's one. And number two, I always thought of Nehru as more Papa Nehru to his children. That's what I pointed out in the previous session. Papa Nehru to his children rather than Chacha Nehru to the rest of the world. He was Papa Nehru. That's why he groomed Indira Priyadarshini in the 60s to be the prime minister of the country. Indira groomed Rajiv. She wanted Sanjay to be the prime minister. Then Rajiv became the prime minister. Rahul Gandhi today rules the roost in the Indian National Congress. So are we like, being to a family, this grand old party has subjugated itself to its own death. I mean, that's detrimental to the party. It is a matter of deep shame. And Nehru is responsible for that. Is he not? Second question, that was.
First question you were asking about the First Amendment, which was recently debated in the Constitution also, Constitution in the Parliament also, where the Prime Minister spoke about First Amendment and how Nehru kind of curtailed unreasonable restrictions. But that is exactly what I'm trying to point at. Nehru was a strong advocate of freedom of speech, but he had to, as any prime minister would have done, because so we have many of his writings about why he went ahead with the First Amendment, because the communal strife that India saw from 1946 to 51 was just not ending. The Noakhali riots, where Nehru went to Bihar to stop the riots, the Hindu-Muslim right.
That will justify what's happening in Kashmir. There is a freedom ban on freedom of speech.
No, no. So it was reasonable restrictions. That is what I'm talking. Reasonable. So Nehru had very these things to say about that. If freedom of speech means the majority Hindu Muslim riots and trying and speech means defaming a particular community, we need to kind of put in these kind of restrictions so that, and he was also kind of he in after the first election he was very categorical in saying that we after winning the elections he was very categorical in saying that there is no two way. But what the 1952 elections did was that it gave us a direction, it gave the Congress a direction to take communal tendencies head on. This is what he said, and within this kind of understanding, he brought the reasonable restrictions clause because things were just blowing out of control at that point of time, and that was and he also kind of read the Kharge, Mallikarjun Kharge, the current Congress chief, had very good had historical facts to say in the parliament in his speech on which I have done a story also. So on how these reasonable restrictions were introduced. So it is completely wrong to kind of assume that Nehru, who was an ardent advocate of freedom of speech, was deliberately trying to put restrictions on Article 19 to kind of further or advance his own power. That was not the case. But the hate campaign that Hindu communalists and the Muslim communalists at that point of time carried out, which resulted in a lot of violence in Indian society, forced him to do that First Amendment thing. So, and the second one was dynasty. So Nehru, that is, I'm very clear that Nehru until his deathbed did not choose his successor. After him, Lal Bahadur Shastri became the prime minister. It was also he will know better. He's a historian, but it was Lal Bahadur Shastri who was the prime minister after, and he actually did not. It was from, according to how what I think is that it was Indira Gandhi who made the Congress a sort of dynastic power, introduced Sanjay Gandhi first, and then brought Rajiv Gandhi first, and made Congress a dynastic party. But Nehru did not formally, he may have groomed Indira Gandhi as someone who may have a public life, a politician's life, but did not choose her as a successor. It was Lal Bahadur Shastri who succeeded Nehru at that point of time. So I think to kind of blame Nehru for making Congress a dynastic party is misplaced.
Other questions? So as you gather your thoughts, let me ask you, Mr. Ajoy, we were talking about freedom of speech. You yourself represent a media institution which has multiple court cases, as well as were often a victim of threats and attacks by the right-wing outfits as well as their propaganda machineries. So you were mentioning about Nehru writing under pseudonyms, criticisms against himself. And I'm also reminded of what Nehru had published in a Bengali publication called The Modern Review. He has written, we should be wary of giving too many temptations to Mr. Nehru, for he loves his popularity too much. India needs no Caesars. So, being placed as a journalist in the present political scenario, how would you look back and reflect on Nehru as a statesman?
I don't think there can be any two opinions around that. He was a statesman, and it was not for us to kind of analyze every tall global leader, be it the Ghana's president that point of time, Tito, Suharto, Octavio Paz, who I quoted here. Everyone considered him as a statesman who had a futuristic understanding of how India could be. He was not caught in his shell. He was always outward looking, and Nehru had many things to talk about why India should always be kind of outward looking and learn from it, and also learn from good experiences of other countries and other political movements, and also kind of send our own strengths and share our own strengths with other countries. And he was actually, and why he earned the kind of name, like because he was constantly very vocal about supporting and standing in solidarity with oppressed nationalities, mostly all of them who wanted freedom from any kind of colonial regime. Nehru supported it, and in fact, we have carried one story where Nehru, in fact, All India Radio carried out program to be aired in Kenya also, where where the All India Radio from Delhi was kind of championing the Kenyan liberation cause. So he was constantly looking for what he said as was one world where no one kind of exerts power over another. It's non-alignment, he policies, his the way he kind of conceptualized India. Everyone says that Rajgopalachari has spoken about how he created a license permit Raj. But can you tell me anyone at that point of time, Tata or Birla, who could have carried out this level of industrialization like Nehru did, and generated so much of employment? It is still the PSUs in, as recently as 2008 during the economic recession, that the PSUs held India in good stead. And all of these things are, I'm not saying that Nehru did not commit mistakes, but he had a vision, and he had a vision, and he carried out with all honesty. He may have failed in many things of what he wanted to be or how things turned out to be, but he had a vision, and he was honestly went about doing and implementing those things at the lead. And he was not just making, he was not making false promises like some of our leaders today. He is not kind of talking in the language of socialism and democracy and crushing democracy at the ground, on the ground. So he was a statesman, and you may agree with him or not agree with him, but he was a statesman.
Thank you for your wonderful paper, and we really appreciate Nehru, and we could not imagine instead of Nehru, if Modi was the formative prime minister, how India would have been today. So we really appreciate Nehru for his as a statesman and first prime minister. But as I would say, your paper, I felt little eulogizing Nehru, and some of the points also I want to make, maybe to balance. In his discovery of India, he gave only about some 2 paragraphs about South India. Whereas now Congress is in ICU, we are giving all the 26, but he gave us only 2 pages in his discovery of India. So how did Nehru view South India? That's one of the questions. It's not RSS criticism, it is from his own book I'm bringing. And second, he is a socialist and communist and all, but talking about Nehru in 1959, he dissolved EMS government. How you will look at it? And again, one more thing.
I think we can focus on that part, and after that, you can ask the question.
Okay, perfect.
I'm not saying that Nehru did not make mistakes. I was just I focused my paper on two aspects of his personality which made him Nehru the politician. One is that his empathetic inner soul and his ability, which kind of prodded him to give up on his own privileges also, and look at every kind of decision making with the with his capacity of hindsight to think of like what is the road ahead. He never discounted history or falsified history also. He looked at history in whichever way he could look at. It may not be accurate because but he was not a historian. He was still very, very interested in history, world history, as an internationalist and trying to learn from those experiences. How many leaders do we have in current times who can do that? Do we have that crop anymore, which Nehru represented or kind of personified? There were at one point of time, Nehru was a leader who was sought out for that we want to become like him. We want to kind of but currently there is not the elites which I spoke about of India also kind of inculcated those Nehruvian values of empathy and hindsight and and had some kind of compassionate understanding of things around them. Now, do we have those elites who are trying to look for a progressive future or trying to bring about some kind of equal world, or they are not? So that is the aspect that I was touching upon. He had many, like he failed on. He was like when I was talking about Irfan Habib discussion with Nehru on the international situation. At that point of time, Irfan Habib says that Nehru was extremely buoyed and like kind of influenced by how China was progressing. So he was a fan of how China was progressing, and Irfan Habib did not agree with him. So and that is why, but it was China who which kind of backstabbed Nehru in a way. His annexation of Goa, the unfortunate dismissal of Namboodiripad government in Kerala, all of these things were were decisions where he may have made mistakes, but his core self, I think, never kind of changed. So I think it was Mountbatten who said that had Nehru died in 1957, he would have died as the most popular leader of India that India has ever produced. But it was after 1957 that Nehru's popularity considerably went down. But even during his core values remained the same if his writings or his interventions are any indication.
I agree, but historically, his less awareness of South India.
Yes, yes.
And
He may have. He was a North Indian.
Negation of South
He
India
was.
with two paragraphs.
Yeah.
But we are more kinder. We are giving 20
Yeah.
units for Congress.
But the southern state,
even after giving two paragraphs.
I feel that many of the physics like the southern states incorporated Nehruvian values in a much better way than the North Indian states could.
Yes.
Actually.
And again, instead of Gandhi, Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi, Rahul Gandhi, Sonia Gandhi, they could have used Rahul Nehru, Sonia Nehru. No, it's basically Nehru. That is the negation of Nehru. By the Nehru dynasty. That's also a contradiction. It's more apt.
They could have, but Indira Gandhi was married to Firoz Gandhi and she did not break from the tradition of accepting her husband's name. So those are small things I feel. Yeah, but whenever we don't say, we always, whenever this family is under attack, they are not called Nehru's children. They are called people from Nehru Gandhi family. And these five names are not the only ones. There were maybe many more who have used they're privileged to kind of get positions or were kind of thrown into rings of political corridor, in political corridors.
Questions? So while you reflect on your thoughts, let me take you to this narrative of Gandhi, 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 and this exclusion of Nehru. So you extensively covered the 2024 Lok Sabha elections, and one thing that was particular about this was the opposition parties moving away from the soft Hindutva politics and trying to address the material, concrete issues like unemployment or addressing the farmers' issue or asking for a caste census. And I was surprised when Rahul Gandhi literally posted in his Twitter about the minority issues, and when he literally mentioned the Muslims being attacked in the present India under Modi's rule. The violence against Muslims and Islamophobia. So I was asking, has India attained a political maturity where they have moved from the conventional value-based politics to a neo-Ambedkarite and Nehruvian politics in the contemporary situation? Yeah, have they moved away from this conventional mode of value-based politics in India to a more, practical Nehruvian and Ambedkarite model of politics? Because Congress has taken up Ambedkar as its visionary.
But Nehru is long gone, and after that, like Nehruvian ideas also kind of reshaped according to the times. So we are living post 19 since the 1990s. We are living. We've given up on many kind of Nehruvian ideas, and politics itself has, like in my reporting experience, politics has become very transactional these days, and that is why like people, there is a greater consensus now than in Nehruvian times. Like for example, if you see that the initial Nehruvian period, the growth was very slow, but inflation was the main aspect in which the governments were invested. And if any time there was like the inflation went above the desired category, there were political backlashes. But right now, and so Nehru was okay with the fact that inflation has to be brought under control, even if that meant a very slow growth rate. So and there are many critics like Meghnad Desai, Thankar Roy, this new historians now who was constantly a very critical of Nehru and talking about how India invested its first 20 wasted its first 20 years. But now we are more kind of we are thinking of very fast growth rate, even if it comes at the cost of high prices for the poor. So the my thing is that Nehru's focus in during his term was constantly on the poor. Right now, which party is concerned about the poor overtly? Everyone is talking about economy, but no one is talking about the poor, despite the fact that even if you take that miserably derived poverty line, even then it's 30%. And if you see that real people, more than 60% of Indian population live in extremely impoverished conditions. But none of these parties is talking about that section of the population. They are being appeased through some kind of freebies, communal politics, or divisive politics. But the focus of is not poor, barring probably say Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi. I don't see any other party which focuses on a politics that is centered around poor. And Aam Aadmi Party is a very small party with very little baggage in and is concentrated now. It has won Punjab, but it started off from Delhi, and it has many criticisms, but overtly, its positions are always pro poor. It foregrounds the agenda and the welfare of the poor. And Congress doesn't do it now. BJP doesn't do it now. And none of the South Indian parties are also talking about poor. Everyone is talking of development means fast growth rate and private investments, all of those things. So it has become much more transactional. So the poor have and most common people have an understanding that okay, we cannot anymore look out for a good government which can do something for us. Rather, we can bargain with the government. We can have a transactional relationship with the government, which and whoever is better in doing that, we will vote for them. Those Nehruvian policies have long gone. Congress itself abandoned it.
Good afternoon, sir. In the context of Nehru's leadership, how did his policies successfully balance and uphold India's cultural diversity while ensuring the unity of nations? Could you provide any examples about the balance?
Sorry, he did not get the question.
Could you please repeat?
In the context of Nehru's leadership, how did his policies successfully balance and uphold India's cultural diversity while ensuring the unity of the nation?
How did he achieve cultural diversity?
How did he balance the both?
Okay, all of he thought very deeply about it, and that is why we're talking about the First Amendment. He saw that okay, if not India can sustain itself in the long run only if it retains its composite syncretic traditions and culture. If not, India he saw will get balkanized. So with that kind of an understanding, he went forward, and when he saw, and that is why he was so opposed to any form of communalism. So, and he constantly rejected all forms of communal understanding of a problem, or which includes not just the Hindu Mahasabha at his time or Jansangh at his time, but also the Muslim League of Jinnah. So he was constantly very, very critical, and he saw the first election in 1952 as an opportunity to to directly confront communal forces of India. And he says that if India has to sustain as one country and be a part of one world, India has to retain its composite, diverse culture. He was constantly having some kind of communication engagement with Indian society, which the later prime ministers have had at one stage have distanced themselves from the problems of society while carrying out governance. But Nehru was a leader whose governance and his engagement with the society was constantly, I feel, constantly in talks with each other. Now, unfortunately, I feel the current Prime Minister Narendra Modi is also constantly engaging with the society, but in a very, very sharply different way.
So talking about the balance in Nehru's time and Modi's time, coming back to the 2024 general elections, we see the ruling party as well as the opposition party, the opposition alliance, uh, presenting their ideology of unity in diversity, but with two different interpretations, with two different interpretations. While the BJP is portraying the unity in diversity in a way where Hindutva as something that unites the diverse people of India, the opposition party portrays themselves as a confederation of people who have, Indian people who have their own ways of life. And also, other than at the surface level, when we come to the ground level debates also, we see a movement to turn India into a Bharat on one side, and on the other side, to turn India into an India that is Bharat, which is a union of states. So we were discussing yesterday how Nehru wanted the control of different states. Aga Patel was talking about how Nehru wanted the control of states to be unified at the center. And that's how our constitution was also built, with a strong center, with a federal feature, which some political analysts would call as quasi-federalism. So how has this trajectory shifted from Nehru's period to this modern debates on India as a unified Bharat under Hindutva and India as a union of states, which the opposition party represents?
Nehru's concept of India is, I think all of us know what we call the idea of India, right? That is fundamentally different from how the Hindu right wants to unite India as the Akhand Bharat, what we call now. So it's fundamentally different from how Nehru went about it and how these guys are going about it. Nehru's idea of India was built on five values, which is one of which was secularism, one of which is socialism, democracy, all of these things, and where these five ideas built was how the idea of India was shaped. And out of secularism is one of the most important. Here we are talking about Akhand Bharat, where a section of Indian minorities are not welcome at all. Hindu Rashtra means it's the majority community which will decide the course of India's nation, while pushing all the other different communities into a secondary role, if not thrown out. And Akhand Bharat is entirely, first of all, India is the union of states, and that is how the constitution conceptualized it to, and how would you have, like, for example, India, when he was talking about southern India, northeast, how would you kind of get together a country with Nehru, of course, wanted a centralized state. And that was the kind of beginning of India's modern state, because but with all its federal principles in place, while giving enough autonomy to states for looking after their own subjects. But in India, he kind of, Nehru, I feel, reconciled to the idea that in India, he very reluctantly, for example, mm, agreed to the idea of linguistic division, reorganization of states. So he did not want that, but he finally agreed to it, as that was the only kind of feasible way in which states could be reorganized. But and he was he was for a great advocate of peace, but he did not, while getting together in India as we know of, what we know of today, he used force in Hyderabad against Nizam to accede, or in Goa to make this India possible. So it was not like he was but there is no contradiction as such, because he, as a prime minister, he had compulsions in which he wants to make, make an India out of what we know as today. But it's not alienating. It is all about kind of including these places into what a union of states. Here, the Hindu right doesn't agree with the constitution. They were kind of very, very critical of the constitution, and they thought that it is all full of Western ideas, and India's great traditions were never applied. They wanted Manusmriti, for example, to be applied into the Indian constitution, which may have some good things, but really, really bad things also. So Nehru wanted equality for all, irrespective of caste, creed, religion, faith, or race. But these guys, the Manusmriti, did not question these primordial identities of Indian people at all. They just wanted to reframe it and brought in 1980s. I remember we had published an article how these Vishwa Hindu Parishad sons brought out a new constitution also and did a press briefing at a BJP MP's house in central Delhi, and all it spoke about how how Muslims, Christians, these people were not Indians, and Indian constitution should be like that. So they are all both fundamentally very, very different, and that is why Nehru has become subject of ridicule and criticism. Because if the Hindu right has to go ahead, it has to necessarily defeat all Nehruvian memory from Indian people. And that is why we see that there is a rewrite, they are engaged in task of rewriting history, falsifying history, and by erasing like where Nehru first residence in Murthy Bhavan, it was first residence of as prime minister and it was known as Nehru Memorial Library, but that name has been changed now. And Nehru is a small personality, and in that same how building and it has been turned into a PM's museum where Narendra Modi, who is the current prime minister, has the biggest gallery to himself. So that is the level of megalomania, because but it's just not megalomania. If the Hindu right has to persist in India, it has to necessarily remove all forms of Nehruvian mem in the minds of people. So right now, like for example, and for that they are willing to go in whichever way by circulating fake news. Like for example, Sir was just asking the over that after the First Amendment became a big discussion point recently after the parliamentary debate. But what was First Amendment? First Amendment, the Article 19 always had national security as a restriction to freedom of speech, and attempts to overthrow a government, as these were the two clauses in which freedom of Article 19, freedom of speech did not work. So after Supreme Court, so many communal incidents happened. So the Supreme Court held that public order can be is not contradictory to these clauses of national security and government's overthrow. And public order was introduced as a clause in as reasonable restrictions. It was not that no, and of course, but how it is painted now? It is painted now that Nehru was the first one to curb freedom of speech. So while our focus, it's fake, it's misinformation, but and the same. If you tell me that yes, Indira Gandhi went after freedom of press, that's rooted in a historical fact. But the current regime, it is completely by talking about Nehru, also succeeds in their own suppression of dissent and freedom of speech. So we hear all the time that why do you talk about the past all the time? Talk about what you are doing now. Are you not accountable? And they have no answer to that. They constantly deflect and divert attention away from their own misdoings, and keep people busy about what Congress did in the past.
I have also a question related to the Nehruvian secularism. Of course,
Mandar is speaking tomorrow
yeah, you have said that secularism is a key value. Nehru was a secularist.
in Nehru's idea of India.
Yes, yes. So I don't question that, but about the secularism got a European context where the church and the state were war with each other, and India never had such a tradition. India, whether Mughal Empire or earlier, there was a peaceful relation between Indian society and religion. And in Europe, they want to make religion into a remove from the public space, make it into a very private affair through the separation of state and religion. In India, nothing had happened like that. So already Madan and Ashish Nandi criticized Nehruvian secularism. And even Rajiv Bhargava is telling that the European secularism, although we have to learn many things from them, is it applicable in India as it is? Because European secularism is problem, even in Europe itself, even in France and many places. So now the Europe itself is recognizing that their homes have secularism may not be healthy to deal with. So in a religion-dominated country like India, where state and religion were never separate, how far the suitability of Eurocentric secularism, which Nehru was trying to apply?
No, no, what equal respect for all religions is the Indian form of secularism. What else could I? Many scholars have written about it. Ashish Nandi may have criticized it. Rajiv Bhargav may have offered a critique. But as I imagine myself, I'm not someone who can comment on the theoretical debate around it. I can perhaps think of me in Nehru's shoes and how to go about it. When you're convinced that everyone should be treated equally. And Nehru himself came from a very religious family. His mother was deeply religious, so he knew that Indian people are deeply religious. But to prefer one religion over another is a decision that an administrator had to make. And Nehru was convinced that no religion, everyone had to be respected equally and treated equally, and that's why he went about it. And it also has certain, like I was talking about history as a discipline, that how Hindu-Muslim conflict was sought to be foregrounded as India's understanding of the past by colonial some of the British historians at that point of time. So when this understanding is being sought to be built that India's history is divided along Hindu, Muslim, and British lines, and India and British came to give some semblance of order in a country constantly living in a memory of different Hindu-Muslim conflicts. So Nehru challenged that idea, that historical understanding itself. No, that was never the case. And later, many historians also spoke about, worked on this aspect of that British falsification was also like, I mean, after 1857, Nehru writes that and many historians are of the opinion saying that this Hindu-Muslim conflict, that India is a divided nation where the Britishers have come and trying to kind of modernize it and trying to give it some sense of nation, was absolutely wrong in trying to it, because there was never such big memory of a Hindu-Muslim conflict. That is not to say that Hindu-Muslim conflict never happened in India's history, but there was no strong memory. So I was listening to Ramila Thapar recently, the historian, and she says that the British Parliament discussed how Somnath temple, which was destroyed by Mahmud of Ghazni, is still living in Indian memory of how Hindus and Muslims are so against each other. But Romila Thapar conclusively has proven that there was no such living memory, and it is British manufacturing of that conflict in its historical understanding so that they could keep ruling India. So when you're coming out of that context, Nehru in his discovery of India also sees through these aspects of British writing of India's history, where Hindus and Muslims are seen as two different nations, and eventually the two nation theory held up to its whatever strength, and India saw partition. So, but once you have this option of you already have a divided nation, what is the kind of India you are trying to build? And Nehru thought along those lines, and he was convinced that India has to be a secular country where even the minorities have to be respected. And this is truly incredible, because as a Hindu, as a Hindu himself, a Kashmiri Brahmin himself, whose family was always attached to some kind of Mughal courts also, he could have easily secured power for himself and his classes. He did not do that. And that is a noble quality for me.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time. And if you have further questions, you can always engage with Ajoy and Ashirwad later on. So thank you for being such an engaging audience. I hope to take the discussions we had here beyond this session. Thank you so much. Zindabad.
Thank you for the session, Mr. Ajoy Ashirwad. I also thank Mr. Shaheen Nakil for moderating the session. I invite Mr. Amit David sir to hand over the momentum and our token of gratitude to Mr. Ajoy Ashirwad. As we come to the end of this enriching seminar, let us take a moment to express our gratitude to everyone who made this event a success. For that, I welcome Bhavya to propose the vote of thanks. Good evening, everyone. It is both an honor and privilege to have the opportunity to deliver the vote of thanks for this plenary session on the topic Nehru, the man behind the politician. First and foremost, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed chief guest, Mr. Ajoy Ashirwad M, for his enlightening and inspiring session. Your expertise and insights have enriched our understanding and provided us with valuable takeaways. A sincere thank you to the Department of English, sponsors and partners, and a big thank you to the technical team, event staff, and volunteers for their tireless efforts in planning and executing this session so seamlessly. Your dedication behind the scenes has been the backbone of today's success. To all participants and attendees, thank you for your active engagement and enthusiasm. As we are close to the end of the day, let us take forward the knowledge we have gained and continue the conversation beyond this forum. Thank you once again, and I hope to see you all at future events. Thank you. And with that, we come to the end of our afternoon session. We will meet tomorrow again for the fourth plenary session of the National Conference. Tea will be served outside, so participants should have the tea and then proceed home. Thank you and have a nice day ahead.